Okay, thank you. So it's great to be here. I'm going to be talking about work that's joint work with Falk Leader, who's now at UCLA, and Fred Callaway, who's at NYU. So as you can see on the slide, I am in both a psychology department and a computer science department. And as a consequence, I end up with two different views of human minds. So if I'm in the psychology department, then I learned that humans are kind of embarrassing. We're predictably irrational. We suffer from inevitable illusions. We have fallible reasoning. Our minds are kludges. The way in which we think is often held up as being prone to a variety of different kinds of errors. But when I cross the university to the computer science department, instead I learned that humans are inspiring, right? So my computer science colleagues want to create intelligent systems that are able to do the kinds of things that human minds can do, that are able to solve challenging problems, that are able to perform the kinds of acts of intelligence that we only associate with human beings. So if you're not sufficiently inspired by the things that human minds can do, here's a nice example, right? So creating a chess playing system was a goal for AI that was inspired by trying to capture this capacity of human intelligence. And ultimately, machines were able to do that. And this is a picture from the system created by IBM, Deep Blue, beating Garry Kasparov, who was a world chess champion at the time. But it's also worth pointing out that this wasn't a fair contest. So Kasparov, was searching around one position a second, whereas Deep Blue was searching around 100,000 positions per second. Deep Blue was powered by an industrial power plant. Kasparov was powered by, black coffee and a piece of toast, right? So even though this was a situation where the computer ended up winning, the human is still inspiring in the way in which they're solving this problem using far less resources than the computer is using. And this is still a situation which is true when we look at our current AI systems, that those AI systems are using far more data and massive amounts of energy when compared to human brains. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is how to resolve this paradox, where I think there's a way that we can actually see why it is that people make the kinds of errors that they do and really understand those errors while still being impressed and inspired by human minds. And the basic idea is to recognize that humans have limited cognitive resources. That's something that leads us to make errors when we make decisions. But critically, that we do a good job of using those resources. And that's something that lets us solve many different problems efficiently. And what I'm going to do is present a mathematical framework which we can use for trying to characterize this second part here, the idea that we're able to do a good job of using those resources. What does it mean to do a good job? Well, that requires us to go back and revisit what we think rational decision-making looks like. So the classic standard that humans are compared to in this work that sort of points out ways in which humans are embarrassing is expected utility theory. This is how we're taught rational agents should make decisions. You take the action that has highest expected utility, right? And so the focus here is on selecting that action. You could sort of reduce this to a slogan, something like "do the right thing," right? You're sort of trying to choose the thing to do that is the thing that maximizes that expected utility. But there are two problems with this. One problem is that there's nothing in here which is really about a cognitive process, right? So there's nothing in here that says anything about what might be going on inside the head of the decision maker. It's what we in cognitive science would call a behaviorist theory, because it's just focused on the actions that you take in the environment based on the contingencies of that environment. The second problem, which is more of a challenge for just using this as a prescription for creating an intelligent system, is that it doesn't say anything about the computations that you need to do in order to choose that action. And in many situations, it's actually just completely computationally intractable to evaluate expected utilities that might be associated with actions. You have to consider all of the possible outcomes, assign probabilities to those outcomes, and then compute this expectation. And that's something which is not realistic for many of the kinds of decisions that human beings have to make. It's also not realistic for many of the decisions that computers have to make. And so as a consequence, people in artificial intelligence began to explore an alternative way of defining rationality, I'm going to talk about this under the name of resource rationality, because what it does is put the computational resources that we have in the foreground. But the original theory has gone under various names, including things like bounded optimality, meta-level rationality, computational rationality, and so on. So the key idea behind resource rationality is that rather than focusing on the choice of this external action, the way we characterize a rational agent is in terms of the strategy that they use for selecting that action. And so the rational agent is the one that uses the strategy that best trades off the utility that you derive from an action and the computational cost that was involved in selecting that action. And so the way this is expressed in this equation is that we imagine that we're going to perform a series of computations, C, that are going to modify our beliefs, B, such that we're going to get to a point where, based on some set of beliefs that we have, we're going to then take the action that maximizes expected utility with respect to those beliefs. And we care about the utility of the action that's derived from that process, as well as the computational costs that are involved in getting to that point. And so this definition has two virtues. First of all, it's something which is achievable by agents that have finite computational resources. So this is actually a realistic standard for thinking about rational action. But second, it is actually something that supports developing cognitive theories, right? So in expected utility theory, we have this action in the external world, but the human or the decision maker in general is treated as a kind of black box. In resource rationality, we think about this sequence of computations that are being performed in order to select that action. And now we have a way of generating hypotheses about what those computations should be. And so by thinking about those computations as emerging from a rational process of making good decisions about what we're going to think about, we actually end up with a model which is one that allows us to make predictions about things like what kinds of strategies humans should be engaged in if they're doing a good job of solving these problems. So one thing that you can do with this approach is characterize what makes something a good heuristic. And in fact, many of the heuristics that have been held up as instances of human irrationality are things that we can understand as resource rational strategies. So probability matching, in which you make responses in proportion to the frequency with which they're rewarded, is something which can make total sense if you think about decisions as being based on a small number of samples that we're generating from a simulation of the world. Anchoring and adjustment is something that we can understand if we think about it as we have access to an iterative algorithm for updating our beliefs, and then we want to trade off how long we're running that algorithm with the quality of the estimates that we get. And as a consequence, we're going to be biased towards whatever our initial estimates were in many situations. Making decisions where we overrepresent extreme events, like thinking about shark attacks when we want to go swimming in the ocean, is something that makes sense if we're trying to make decisions based on a small number of samples of possible outcomes. We want to overweight those outcomes that have high utility values, whether positive or negative. And that's something that actually captures a bunch of errors that people make in decision making when compared to classic sort of ideas about expected utility. And finally, doing things like making decisions based on sampling is something that we can think in the same terms as something that's an effective use of a limited computational resource. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about those ideas today. What I'm actually going to focus on is another question, which is how we can derive optimal strategies for our intelligent agents, right, that allow us to make hypotheses about the kinds of heuristics or strategies that people might adopt. So in all of this previous work, we were kind of taking heuristics that we knew existed, and we're explaining why those heuristics might make sense from the perspective of resource rationality. But that has the criticism that it's kind of a post hoc way of thinking about things, right? We kind of already knew that that heuristic was there. What we'd like to be able to do is to say, if we can describe a new situation that people might face, then be able to give a good characterization of what performance in that situation might look like. And the key insight here is that the way that I framed this idea of resource rationality, where we think about it as performing a sequence of computations that modify our beliefs such that we end up with beliefs that result in us choosing a good outcome, turns this problem into one of a sequential decision making. So here, the problem of choosing a cognitive strategy to follow becomes a sequential decision problem, where in that sequential decision problem, we're, instead of thinking about actions in the external world, we're thinking about the computations that we're going to perform as the analogs of the actions for a classic sequential decision problem. And so as a consequence, we can then formulate this problem of choosing how to think in terms of what's called a meta-level Markov decision process, an idea that's been introduced in the computer science literature. And then we can solve that meta-level Markov decision process using methods from reinforcement learning, although this asterisk here is to sort of point out that, in fact, solving these is quite difficult, and we had to come up with some clever methods of our own in order to actually solve these meta-level Markov decision processes effectively. So the reason why I'm giving a talk, which is about resource rationality in the context of the RL focus for your talk series, is that essentially what we're doing is turning this problem of coming up with good cognitive strategies into a problem that you should be able to recognize in the form of an RL problem. So hopefully folks here are familiar with the idea of a Markov decision process. So Markov decision process is our standard model for thinking about things like reinforcement learning, where we imagine agents as being in a particular state of the world, taking some action. As a consequence of taking that action, the state transitions to a new state, and then the person derives some reward as a consequence of the action that they selected. And then in that new state, they're going to take some action. Transition probabilities are going to determine what state they transition to, and they're going to receive some reward based on their action, and so on and so on and so on. And so this characterization of a Markov decision process allows us to use a bunch of tools that have been developed in computer science to actually solve the Markov decision process and work out the optimal policy for choosing those actions based on the states that we're in. And what that optimal policy does is tell us, if you're in a particular state, what action you should take in order to maximize the long-run reward. That framework of a Markov decision process, we can translate into a model for telling us how to think by making a change where instead of states, we now have beliefs. Instead of actions, we now have computations. And we still have rewards. Those are reflecting the cost of computation or the benefit that we derive when we actually take an action. And we have a transition probability, which determines how our beliefs are changed by executing that computation. And then we have one special kind of action, which is this one, which says, I am done computing, I'm done thinking, and I'm going to take an action in the world. And when I take that action in the world, based on my current beliefs, I derive some reward. And so this way of formulating the problem is one that then allows us to use those same tools that we're used to using for Markov decision processes to then derive optimal cognitive strategies. Where here, an optimal cognitive strategy is going to be a sequence of computations that we're going to perform based on the beliefs that we have at that particular moment. And so this tells us how much we should think when we're trying to solve a problem and what we should think about. And that actually gives us the tools that we need in order to actually sort of try and understand human decision-making in this more sophisticated way. So that's a little abstract. I'm going to give you some concrete examples. What I'm going to do in each of the cases I'm going to talk about two kinds of things. Risky choice, well, it's sort of like a sort of relatively straightforward, simple decision-making task, and a planning problem. And in each case, I'll talk about one version where we make the decision problem, the sequential decision problem, explicit, and one version where it's implicit. And you can hopefully see how the same principles can transfer across those two settings. So the first of these is looking at multi-alternative risky choice. This is joint work with Paul Kruger, Fred Callaway, Cheyenne Gull, and Falk Leader. And here, the task that we're using is one that makes those computations explicit so that we're actually able to follow the kinds of strategies that people are adopting in this space. So here, the idea is that people are choosing between different gambles. Each of those gambles is associated with different outcomes. So we sort of have an urn which has some number of balls in it, and those balls, some number have the letter A on them, some number have the letter B, some have the letter C, and so on. And then what the gambles differ in is the payoff that they provide when you sample a particular ball. So, for each of these gambles, there's some amount of money that it pays off when you see, say, a ball that is a B. The catch is that you don't know what that information is, what the payoffs are that are associated with those different balls, right? And again, you can think about this as these are the different outcomes. You don't know what the outcome, the value is that's associated with those outcomes. And so this is sort of simulating that problem of calculating an expected utility, where you have to evaluate what the possible outcomes are and also what the value is that you'd assign to those outcomes undertaking different actions, right? So here the actions correspond to those gambles. So the catch is that you don't have that information. What you have to do is click on these cells and you get the information about what the payoff would be if that particular ball was observed, if you selected that particular gamble. And then you can reveal as much information as you want. And then you can make a choice of what gamble you want to play. So this is a variant on the classic mouse lab paradigm, which has been used to look at the kinds of strategies people use in decision making. So we can take this classic problem, we can translate this into a meta-level markup decision process, where here the beliefs correspond to the values that are hidden behind those question marks, right? So you have beliefs about what those possible values might be. The actions you're taking are evaluating individual options in a way that allows you to fill in some of those blanks, and you're updating your beliefs. And we do this here deterministically. So you're just revealing that information. There's a cost that's involved in gathering those pieces of information, and we're going to vary that cost. So there's sort of an implicit cost in just taking more time in doing the experiment, but there's also potentially an explicit cost for gathering information. Then at some point you say, okay, I'm done collecting information, I'm going to act. You choose a gamble and you get a payoff associated with that gamble. So we were interested in just understanding what the optimal strategies are for this kind of task. And so as a first step in doing that, what we did was kind of try and cover the whole space of mouse lab tasks, where we had a variety of stakes. So the stakes are drawn from the payoffs that are behind those cells are drawn from Gaussian distributions with different standard deviations. We also varied the dispersion that's associated with those probabilities. So by drawing from either a distribution which is very sparse, in which case it's likely that one of those outcomes has higher probability than the others, versus one which is very uniform. So here it's very likely that the probabilities across the different outcomes are very similar to one another. And then what the cost is for gathering information in terms of the number of sort of points that you might lose for each of the times you click to try and get a piece of information before making a decision. And then in each of these conditions, so we sort of crossed all of these conditions, and then we generated 20 scenarios to find the optimal cognitive strategy. So this is a total of, in this case, 1,000 different scenarios that are generated across these 50 different conditions. And then what we could do is take that meta-level MDP, solve the meta-level MDP, and work out what the optimal strategy looks like. And the way I'm going to show you these optimal strategies is by taking the clicks that people performed in this task and then transforming them to a canonical structure. So what we're going to do is transform this so that the column that has the most revealed cells appears on the left most, and then the next most revealed cells, and so on. And then we're going to order the rows by, in the same way, the row that has the most revealed cells, and then so on. And so that gives us a canonical format for looking at the strategy that was used in this case. You can see that somebody explored a lot of this first row, and then some of the next row, and some of the next one. I'm sorry. So the way that we order the rows is based on the output probabilities, right? So here, the highest probability row appears first, then the second highest probability, and then the third highest, and so on. And so that's the way we're going to try and canonicalize this. So when we do that, we take those 1,000 problems, we look at the optimal strategy for each of those 1,000 problems, and then we performed a cluster analysis to try and identify consistent strategies that emerge across those 1,000 problems. And what you see is that you can actually do a good job of characterizing the optimal strategies with just sort of 4 clusters. And so 2 of those clusters correspond to classic strategies that have been found in the literature, looking at these kinds of mouse lab tasks. So this one is essentially clicking everything. And this one is where you are just clicking across the highest probability outcome, and then you're making a decision where you're selecting the option that has the highest payout that you reveal, right? So this is called the weighted additive strategy. This is called the take the best strategy. And what we can show is that this take the best strategy is the optimal solution for what we could call non-compensatory low stakes problems. So that is problems where there's a high skew in the probabilities of the different outcomes, and for which the stakes that are associated with the different outcomes are relatively low, right? So in that case, it's not really worth revealing a lot of information. You reveal enough information that you're able to, make a reasonable choice among these gambles, and then you move on. But we also find that there are other strategies that are optimal for solving these problems. So if you look at these, this one is a sort of satisficing strategy, where essentially what you do is you sort of click across and then you at some point stop. And so you're still focused on the highest probability outcome, but at some point you say, okay, I've seen enough, I'm going to make a decision. So basically, if you see a high enough payoff, then you're willing to do that. And we call this strategy take the best satisficing, where essentially what you do is you focus on that highest probability row, but then as soon as you see a payoff that's above some threshold, you're ready to take a bet. And then the other strategy is a combination of that sort of take the best. So you consider the entire highest probability outcome, and then you do a little bit of satisficing in the next highest probability outcome. And so these are sort of variants on this take the best strategy that turn out to be optimal strategies. Okay, so a natural question you could ask is, what do people do when they're presented with this same set of problems? And so we took exactly that same set of 1,000 problems, and we ran 2,368 participants across those 50 conditions to look at what they did. And then we did the same kind of cluster analysis on the human data. And what we find is a remarkably similar set of strategies that are demonstrated by people. So essentially, you see these same 4 strategies. They're a little more sort of like deterministic in covering everything than the optimal model was. But otherwise, you can see these same 4 strategies emerge in the human data. But there's also another cluster, which corresponds to basically taking a decision without gathering any information. We call this a random strategy. And that's something that people do, but the model doesn't do. Okay. So the other thing we can do, in addition to sort of characterizing the kinds of strategies that people follow, is to ask whether they use those strategies in the circumstances that the model does. And what we see when we do that is that the answer is broadly yes. So if we just focus on those 4 strategies that show a correspondence, you can see things like the overall proportion of the use of those strategies is very similar. And they're sensitive to the same factors. So for example, this green strategy, the take the best strategy, becomes more popular both for the model and for people as you start to have more skewed distributions. So that's when you're sort of in this compensatory condition. So non-compensatory condition. Likewise, the weighted additive strategy, where you click everything and make a decision based on that, is most popular when the underlying cost is 0, right? It sort of only really makes sense to explore everything if there's no real cost that's associated with that. But you can also see that there's some meaningful differences in the distributions of responses across people and the model. And when we look overall at human performance, comparing it to this kind of criterion, we can see that there's ways in which people are falling short of optimal performance. So people are achieving about 60 to 70% of what they could be achieving if they were following the optimal strategies. And so the issue isn't that people don't have access to the right strategies for deploying when they're solving these problems. It's essentially that they're not effectively choosing which strategy to use when they're solving a particular problem. And we can break that down so we can actually look at what the sources are of underperformance in this task. And a big chunk of the underperformance is a consequence of imperfect strategy selection. That's what this blue sort of part of the pie chart corresponds to here. And in particular, doing things like adopting the random strategy, which is not something the model ever does, or using strategies that are either too effortful or not effortful enough in the circumstances where it's optimal to use those strategies. And so based on this, we were able to design other versions of this experiment where we could modify the incentives and end up with people actually showing something which is much closer to resource rational performance. But it gives us an interesting picture of, if you wanted to improve people's decision-making in this setting, it's not really a matter of educating people about the kinds of strategies they could use. It's more a matter of helping them to recognize when the strategy that they're using is not the right one for the problem that they're solving. So the second example I'm going to give is in a setting where instead of having this explicit process of gathering information, we have a more implicit process of gathering information. And this is joint work with Fred Callaway and Antonio Rangel. What we were interested in this task is a classic problem of simple choice, right? So here's an example. You're going to choose a snack to eat. You have to decide which one of these you're interested in eating. And then in the process of making that decision, you're going to look at these different items. and we're interested in trying to understand how the time that you're spending looking at different items is going to be related to the choice that you make. So research on this kind of simple choice task where people's eye movements have been tracked has shown that fixation time and choice are related, that high value items are fixated more, and that that's true particularly as time goes on. So if you look at the last fixation that people make, the last thing they look at, that's a good predictor of the choice that they end up making. So one way that these effects have been explained in the past is via something called the attentional drift diffusion model, which is a model that just says what you're doing is sort of weighting information which is coming from these different sources, but you're getting more influenced by information which is coming from whatever it is that you're currently fixating on. And one problem with this model is that while it does a good job of capturing some of these effects, it doesn't actually say anything about how you decide what you're going to fixate. And that is an important part of this behavior. People are making decisions about how they're going to gather information. So we were interested in using essentially exactly the same model as the one that I just presented to explain behavior on this task. And there's a simple way of setting this up. So basically, we assume that there's some distribution of beliefs that are associated with these different items, where that distribution of beliefs characterizes the distribution over possible utilities for those items. Then, as you fixate on something, you think about it a bit, or you retrieve information from memory, or you do something which gives you a sample of the utility that you associate with that item. And then you just do a Bayesian update where you're updating that distribution of beliefs. And so this process, again, can be cast as a meta-level Markov decision process. So here now the beliefs correspond to these utility distributions. The actions of these evaluations correspond to getting a sample from a utility distribution. And then the costs are costs that are involved in, just sort of spending more time doing this task, but also costs that are associated with switching from looking at one thing to another. That's one difference that we make from the previous model, is that we have this extra switch cost because people can spend more time looking at an individual thing and drawing multiple samples from that thing. And then at some point, you make a decision that you've thought enough, and you make a choice, and you receive a payoff that's associated with that choice. So we can evaluate this model on data that have come from these kinds of tasks. There's a lot of data in these settings. I'm going to focus on data that comes from an experiment by Krybich and Rangel. In this experiment, people had to come to the lab hungry. They would rate 70 food items for how much they liked them. And then they'd go through a trinary choice where they would see these three objects and they'd have to make a selection of which one they wanted. And then from a random trial, the choice that they made is selected, and then they're given that item, and then they have to wait in the lab for another 30 minutes. So they're sort of well incentivized to make good choices about the kinds of food that they want to eat. So just using that simple Bayesian model that I showed you, where what you're doing with your fixations is gathering information about utilities that you're going to use to make a decision, we get the classic kinds of effects that I was talking about. So you see this direct relationship between fixation time and choice, where the model predicts that you're going to be more likely to choose something that you spend more time looking at. And basically the reason why this happens is that if you have this set of options in front of you, the first thing you might do is look at each thing to get a sense of, just how good it is in general. And then you might go back and look at the things that you're, sort of most likely to choose, the things that you sort of estimate as having the highest utility, to try and refine your utility estimates for those things. And as a consequence of doing that, you're going to spend more time looking at those things. You're going to spend more time sampling from the distributions that are associated with those better outcomes. And so what that means is that high value items get fixated more because they're the ones that are likely to be in that process of comparison that you're engaging in as you're finishing this problem. And that's particularly true as time goes on, because as you start to rule things out and become more certain about what their highest candidates are, you're going to spend more time looking at those items that are highest value. And out of this model, we also get that you're more likely to choose the item that you looked at last. Okay, so these are two examples of how you can use this framework to think about simple kinds of decision-making problems. When I motivated this talk, I talked about chess as an example of a setting where humans are able to do impressive kinds of things. And so we were also interested in using resource rationality to understand how people might engage in planning. And this is joint work with Fred Callaway, Bas van Opusden, Sharon Gold, Priyam Das, Paul Kruger, and Falk Leader. So here, the idea is that what we want to do, again, I'll show you one example where we have a sort of explicit choice about the information that you gather, and one example where it's implicit. And so in this explicit choice case, what we're going to do is ask people to help the spider solve a planning problem, where the spider is trying to find the most rewarding path through this maze. It's a very simple maze. There's only a few paths that they could take. So here, the reward is the sum of the rewards that are associated with the nodes that are traversed by the spider. The catch is that, like in the mouse lab task, you don't actually know the rewards, and you have to click on those cells in order to reveal them. And so we call this mouse lab MDP. This is a sort of generalization of that mouse lab task to a setting where now you have to engage in a planning process where you're trying to work out, okay, not just what's the best single action, but what's the best sort of trajectory that you should take through a set of possible, a sequence of actions. And again, we can express this in terms of a Markov decision process, right? So here the beliefs correspond to the values that are hidden behind those nodes. The transitions are, again, sort of deterministic updating of a distribution over those values. The actions are evaluating individual nodes. There's a cost for evaluating those, and at some point you act, in which case you select the optimal trajectory. Okay, so there was a question on the chat about how do we represent limited human resources? So in this case, the assumption that we're making about limited human resources, and this is true in all of the examples that I'm going to show you. So we make assumptions about what are the kinds of computational actions that are available to you. So that's one kind of assumption about constraint, right? So it's like you can only consider one thing at a time, or you can only draw a sample from a distribution of values, like in the previous case, right? So there's some assumption about the cognitive architecture that we're making when we're defining this model. And then the other constraint is manifest through the rewards that we consider here, where essentially what we're doing in all of the examples that I'll show you is assuming that the computational cost increases linearly with time. So that's assuming that either just sort of you're expending effort, and effort is costly in a way that increases linearly with the amount of effort you expend over time, or that there's, another way of thinking about this is in terms of opportunity cost, that you could be doing something else with your cognitive resources, and you're choosing to waste them in spending time in our experiment. And so you want to trade off the rewards that you can derive from doing that with the other things that you could be doing instead of participating in the experiment. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so having set up this planning problem in terms of this meta-level MDP, we're able to solve that meta-level MDP and find out what the optimal strategy is. And when we do that, we find that, in fact, when we compare it to sort of human planning, this optimal cognitive strategy does a better job of capturing people's planning than a lot of classic algorithms that come from computer science, like best first search, breadth first search, depth first search, and so on, as well as proposals that have come from the economics literature, things like what's called a directed cognition model. And the reason why this works is that when we look at the human behavior, what we see is that people demonstrate a kind of adaptivity which we don't see in other kinds of approaches to planning. So what this is doing is plotting the best expected path value that people have found so far, based on the clicks that they've already made, against the number of clicks that they've made. And then the colors here correspond to the probability that people stop searching after having made that number of clicks. And what you should be able to see is that there's a sort of diagonal that goes from the bottom left to the top right, where termination probabilities are low, termination probabilities are high. What this reflects is that people are essentially doing a kind of satisficing in the way that they're searching, where if they've already found a pretty good path and they've already made a bunch of clicks, then they're going to be likely to terminate search, right? So if you've already found a really good path, even after just a couple of clicks, you're like, okay, I'll stop, right? But as the number of clicks you've made increases, the sort of threshold for stopping searching decreases. And this adaptivity is characteristic of the way that humans are planning in this problem. So this is the human data. It's also characteristic of the optimal strategy that we derive using our meta-level MDP, but it's not something which you see in, say, a sort of classic best first search task, right? So best first search can sort of figure out, okay, I found the best thing that I could find, but it's sort of missing this trend where people are sort of making this trade-off between the amount of exploration that they've done already and the quality of the solution they found, and doing this kind of satisficing. And that's something which falls out of our optimal solution. So I motivated this by chess, but the example I showed you with the spider searching through that graph is not very like what Garry Kasparov is doing, right, when he's playing chess. And I've used that motivating example of chess for a long time. I never thought we'd actually be able to do research on chess because it's such a hard problem. So chess is really challenging to study because the state space is extremely large and the optimal solutions are extremely hard to identify, right? So those are things that make it, difficult as an environment in which to think about doing behavioral experiments. But two things changed in the last few years. One of those is a lot of people started playing chess online, and at least one online chess server has released the games that people have been playing online. So we actually have a massive data set of, at this point, about 6 billion chess games that we can look at to try and understand the kinds of things people do when they're playing chess. The other is that AI systems for playing chess have become extremely good in a way where you can essentially kind of treat them as giving you the correct answer for a given configuration of the board. And so those two things allow us to effectively both reduce the dimensionality of the questions we ask about chess, where we can ask those questions in terms of sort of like how well people are doing relative to optimal strategies, where we take the computer chess solutions as being essentially optimal, and give us enough data that we're able to populate that lower dimensional space in a way that's more informative. And so as a consequence of those two changes, we've actually started to do a bunch of work on chess. And one of the things that we've been able to do is to ask whether chess players are rational in the time that they spend thinking about making a chess move. So this is joint work with Evan Russick, Dan Acosta-Kane, Bas van Oppersten, and Marcelo Matar. What we did was look at individual board positions that occurred in chess games in this data set. And here we're just focusing on a subset of 12 million games. It's a much smaller part of that data set. And then in that board position, we ask, what is the value of planning? What's what we call the value of computation in that setting? And the way that we approximate that is by asking, what's the difference in the value of a move which is made after planning 1 step in the future and the value of a move which is made after planning 15 steps in the future? So doing this additional planning out into the future is extra computation that you're asserting. And so what we're able to do then is measure what the magnitude is of the benefit of that extra computation. And that's something that varies across board positions. So just to, and the way that we're measuring that value is in terms of using an AI chess engine to estimate the probability that a player would win the game from the board position that they end up in after making that move. And that's what this is showing here. So this sort of scale from 0 to 1 is the sort of estimated win probability that's produced by that AI chess engine. So this is just 2 examples of 2 board positions that have very different value of computation. In the one on the left, if you think a little bit in this position, if you just sort of think 1 move ahead, you end up using the queen to take the pawn. And the reason why that makes sense is you've gained material, that seems like a good thing to do. If you instead think 15 moves ahead, you do something very different. You use the queen and move it here. And that seems strange, right? You're not actually, gaining any material or anything like that. But the critical thing to notice is that here you have this queen is aligned with this rook, and this rook can move over here and check the king, and then the queen can come down. And basically, there's a checkmate that occurs 7 moves into the future if you don't make this move here. And so that means that there's a big difference in the value of computation, right? And the value of the moves that you end up with as a consequence of doing a little bit of computation versus doing a lot of computation. So this is a board position where thinking more is very worthwhile. In this board position, thinking doesn't help. So if you think 1 move ahead, there's just this knight which is hanging here, right? There's no one is defending it. You just take it. If you think 15 moves ahead, that's still the best move, right? You still end up taking that knight. And so as a consequence, there's no difference between thinking a little bit and thinking a lot. And so this is a case where the value of computation is very low. It's not worth thinking at all. And so what we can then do when we have the value of computation estimated for all of those board positions is look at how that value of computation relates to the time spent planning by the human players. And so what we find is that the amount of time that players spend planning is affected by the value of planning. And so here in all of these plots, I'm showing the amount of time that the players took to make their move on the vertical axis. And this is the value of computation. The increase in board position advantage is a function of that additional computation between 1 step ahead and 15 steps ahead. And then these different numbers here correspond to different time conditions. So this is a game where each player has 60 seconds with no increment in the amount of time they get after each move. This is a game where, they have 1,800 seconds and they get 20 extra seconds after each move. So this is a sort of much longer, slower game. And what we see across all of these time conditions is essentially the same relationship, where as board position advantage increases, so does the amount of time that people take in taking their move. And this is something that we see across all levels of chess players, but it's actually something where the effect increases in magnitude with increased expertise. So as players get better at playing the game, they get better at making these decisions about how to use their time. Okay, so one thing that you might have noticed is that this relationship has a particular form, right? You can sort of see like it's this nonlinearity where the time saturates as a function of the value. We were confused about that. We were like, why does it have that particular form? But it's actually something that you can derive from the chess data itself. So on the top here, I'm showing, this is, it looks like a model, but it's actually, I'm showing you data. And this is something we can do because we have so much data on human chess gameplay. So this is showing in each of these time conditions, how much time is left in the game. And then the colors correspond to the probability that you win from a particular board position advantage. So this is that sort of estimated win probability that's coming out of the AI model. Okay, and so you can see, like, if you're in the first half of the game, the probability that you win the game is very directly related to this board position advantage that's computed by the AI model. So the AI model's computation is independent of the amount of time remaining in the game. It's just saying, how good a position is this regardless of time. And so for the first half of the game, those two things line up. You can see these lines basically go straight down. But then as you start to get to the point where time becomes tight, then board position advantage no longer has that same relationship. Now it has this sort of nonlinear relationship where being in a good board position, it's only being in the sort of the strongest board positions that are sort of maximally advantageous in being able to win the game. And so what that means is that essentially there's a diminishing benefit to board position advantage as you go through the game. And we can make that more precise, where we can say, in a particular board position, you can think about the decision of how much to think in terms of getting a proposal that's going to reduce the amount of time you have left, but give you an increase in your board position advantage. And so the question is like, whether you should take that proposal or not. And so as you get closer to the end of the game, you're going to need to see a bigger increment in the utility that you derive from thinking for the same amount of thinking. And we can sort of show that by tracing these equiprobability contours showing the probability of winning the game. And so from that's where you get this nonlinearity, which is that essentially there's this sort of decreasing value in spending a lot of time thinking, because spending a lot of time thinking gets you into these states where you're sort of running out of time. And when you're running out of time, the board position advantage isn't that worthwhile to you anymore. And so it means that you get this sort of truncation of the benefit of thinking, even if there's potentially a large increment in board position advantage. Okay, so implications. First of all, resource rationality gives us a better normative criterion for evaluating human behavior, right? So this gives us a better way of thinking about, are people actually doing a good job of solving problems in the world? I've kind of presented some evidence to you that maybe on this one, the computer scientists have something right, which is that, it seems like we can actually make sense of a lot of the things that people do that might otherwise look irrational if we start to think about them in the context of making good use of these limited cognitive resources. It also suggests a different way of thinking about addressing deviations from that normative standard. So I talked about in the first part the different kinds of heuristics that people use. And there it seemed like the problem was not one of sort of educating people about how to use Bayes' rule or what expected utility is, but rather just helping them to understand when to use the particular heuristics that they're using. We can actually use this kind of framework to formalize the idea of nudging. I'm just going to go over this very quickly because we're running short on time now. But the basic idea is that once you have a model of how people trade off information gathering with the choices that they end up making, the utility of the choices they end up making, you can then try and design systems which provide people information that guides them to making better choices. And you can define different kinds of criteria here, but one reasonable criterion is one of essentially maximizing the meta level reward, that is allowing them to make good decisions while thinking less. And so we've run experiments where we use this kind of approach to try and construct analogs of this sort of nudging idea in a mouse lab setting, where we control the number of clicks that people would need to make in order to reveal information so that it makes it easier to reveal some information than other information. And just by manipulating how easy it is to get that information, we're able to guide people to making choices where they end up making choices with fewer clicks that end up paying off better and giving them better net earnings in solving these problems. And that framework is one we can actually use to make sense of nudges in a variety of other settings as well. I'm not going to have time to talk about that. The other thing that I would say, and this is sort of in the context of your meeting here, is that by emphasizing cognitive processes and ideas like markup decision processes, this way of thinking about how to model internal cognitive processes is one that supports us searching for mechanisms, right? So unlike that sort of expected utility story where it didn't really say anything about what should be inside people's heads, except maybe probabilities and utilities, we now have some ideas about the kinds of things that we should look for inside people's heads, right? The kinds of cognitive strategies that people should engage in when they're solving particular problems. And that gives us a richer set of targets for modeling human cognition. And in particular, by relating the process of making choices about what cognitive actions to perform to the idea of solving a markup decision process, it's giving us support for connecting the search for those mechanisms to ideas that already come out of things like the reinforcement learning literature, where we have some ideas about how it is that people might solve MDPs through reinforcement learning. And we have some idea about the kinds of neural structures that could be involved in that process. And so to me, this is a way of building a bridge from more cognitive aspects of decision-making to a large literature on reinforcement learning that exists already in the neuroscience and computer science fields. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, Tom, for an excellent talk. So there are a couple of questions from the chat.
Yeah, I'll just go through those.
Okay. Yeah.
So first question, resource rationality makes a lot of sense in constrained, well-defined settings, but in real-world socially complex environments where utility is hard to define and optimization is intractable, do you think it still applies? Does it require significant adaptation to remain meaningful? I mean, so I think the answer here is that this is a theoretical framework that we can use to make sense of the kinds of things that people should be doing in any setting, right? Actually making concrete models of behavior in those more complex settings might be difficult, but the claim that we're making is that the things that we're identifying here in terms of these trade-offs and the way in which you use different kinds of information, decide that you've got enough information, and ultimately end up making decisions, that's something that we should expect to see in all of those environments. And so I think the approach still makes sense there. I think if you wanted to study those kinds of decision-making, you might need to boil it down to something which is simpler in order to be able to make a computational model of it. But the same principles are the principles that we think should be at work in those settings. And then how should we set the cost function? Is it based on a recommended theory? So as I said, in all of the examples that I gave, the only assumption that we're making about that cost function is that it's something which is increasing linearly with time, right? In a way that's consistent with either expended effort or opportunity cost. If you have a setting where you actually know something about the costs that people experience, either because you were able to measure their effort or something else, then you can make a much more sophisticated version of that, right? So you can have meaningful variation in those costs and have that be a component of the model. We didn't do that in the models that I talked about because we really just wanted to make it as simple as possible. And as you can see, we can get sort of the core behaviors without making those assumptions. But it's the kind of thing that I think, if you're operating in an area where there are good theories about what the relevant costs are, then this gives you a tool for exploring what their implications would be for people's behavior. Okay. All right, so there's a question, given Markov models assume sequential state transitions, can they capture simultaneous or parallel nature of human thought processes, or implicit processes that can't be planned, like emotions or motives? Are there extensions or alternative formulations that address this? So yeah, there's nothing here that thinks about parallelism. We've done a little bit of work where we use the same kind of framework to think about like dual systems theory, right? Where you can sort of make an argument that having two systems for solving problems is something that can be resource rational. And you can kind of ask, should you have more than two systems? In that case, the way that we have that set up, it's basically that you first make a choice about, am I going to solve it using this system or that system? And then you execute that system. So it's still kind of sequential, but you at least have these sort of different options for the way in which a problem could be solved. In that setting, we argue that dual systems actually kind of make sense across a wide range of settings, because having more than one system gives you a lot of flexibility in the amount of compute that you end up putting into solving a problem. And having more than two systems introduces additional costs in terms of like deciding which system you're going to use to solve a problem. But I think you could have a corresponding parallel theory where I think in that setting, it might be more about something like, these two things are going to kick off. Do you use the solution that you got from one process, or do you keep running the other process, right? That would be a more realistic sort of dual version of, a more realistic parallel version of dual systems. And I think that's a good question, that you could sort of set up in this kind of setting. Okay. Decision by sampling. Okay, yeah, so I talked about decision by sampling, but I sort of had it on my list of resource rational heuristics. In fact, the way in which that's justified is very different from all of the other things that I had on that list. I was being inclusive in including some work from Rahul Bui and Sam Gershman, who had been thinking about this more in terms of encoding. So there's another, let me show you this. Okay. There's another kind of tradition in economics, which is focused on this idea of rational inattention, where essentially that is, a way to think about it is, it's asking, if you're getting a signal from the environment, how much resolution do you want to get that signal with? It's, so you have a control parameter, but I would think about it as more like you have these sort of signals that have information theoretic costs in a way that seems more like perception. And so a lot of the work that I talk about is, based on sort of processes that are driven by sampling, which is a good sort of intermediate point between these more cognitive things that I think are better characterized by this bounded optimality approach. But that decision by sampling model is one that I think makes more sense in this kind of rational inattention approach, where it's really about what the investment is that you make in what the investment is that you make in the encoding that you have of a signal that you're receiving. And so that's the kind of strategy that they use in order to give this sort of resource rational characterization of decision by sampling. Yeah, and that's in this tradition of efficient coding. Mike Woodford has done a lot of work in this kind of area too. Okay. In the chess studies, do you take into account the time remaining for your opponent? We did not in that particular analysis. Yeah, but that's a good question. That's obviously something that you can think in your opponent's time as well. And we were just looking at the time that people were thinking when it was assigned to their move. And the kinds of strategies they might take would also be sensitive to time for their opponent. But as you could see in the results, even just focusing on the time for one player's moves, we were still able to find that relationship. How reliable are IGA's data for understanding cognitive processes? I think it really depends on how much cognition you're putting on them and how complex the task is. So in the particular case that I talked about, this is a task where the only things on the screen are these three different options, right? And it's a very simple problem. It's a problem of making a choice between these three items. And so in that case, the way that we're interpreting the eye gaze is that, fixations are basically giving you information about these items, which we're representing in terms of samples that come from this distribution. For something like playing chess, eye gaze is much more complicated because there are lots of things that you're potentially evaluating, right? You no longer have an association between a particular physical location and one of the options that you're considering. Because in that setting, like if you're considering different lines, there's some relationship between those lines and pieces on the board, but it's really hard to piece apart, how a particular fixation is related to consideration of a particular line. And so I think you want to, if you're going to use something like eye gaze as a component of a model like this, you want to make sure that the way that it's related, the way that things that people are looking at are related to the cognitive processes you're interested in needs to be particularly transparent. Okay, do you think parallel cognitive processing could result in different steps or results in sequential cognitive processing, more like a decision tree versus a single streamline of steps? Yeah, I mean, I think that is likely to be the case. So one thing here, right? So when I talked about Kasparov, and I say he's searching one position a second, Deep Blue searching 100,000 positions a second. So, in fact, maybe what's going on is that inside his brain, there's lots of parallel processes going on. And so while he's only explicitly considering one position or one line here each second, he is nonetheless, sort of that might be the sort of surface result of much more parallel computation. I think that's possible. Here, the kinds of things that we're able to model are more those sequential processes, and I sort of focused on these kinds of like thought processes like this. I think figuring out how to trade that off against parallel processes is a really good question. This is like the question that was asked before. In particular, when you have sort of ballistic parallel processes, right, where you sort of can't, like a sort of classic system 1, system 2 is that you sort of automatically process something in a relatively superficial sort of parallel way, and then you can do an effortful sequential processing. And I think thinking about how to capture those kinds of processes in this framework is really interesting. Second term is summation. Is it computationally expensive? Do you consider the situation where the cognitive system has no sufficient resources to compute the summation? Right. So this is here. Okay. So yeah, so one concern that you might very reasonably have is that what I've done is to say, maybe let's go back to this one. I said, the problem here is that this is computationally intractable because you need to evaluate all of the possible outcomes, and that's potentially a really complicated thing to do. And I said, instead, we're going to define rationality like this. And now you can argue, I've just made this even more complicated because now instead of doing an evaluation over actions, I have to do this evaluation over policies. And that's an even more complicated space, and it involves considering all of these subcomputations and so on and so on and so on, right? So yes, totally agree. There's a sort of a move here where I've said, let's think instead about this meta level problem, but that meta level problem is more complicated than the original, what we call the object level problem. But I think there are some reasons why that's okay. So the reason is that I think the problem that the humans are solving when they're making a decision is the object level problem. And this problem of like choosing the right policy to follow is actually one that unfolds over a very different time scale than the actually making a decision on the fly, right? So, in your RL setting, right? Like this is the difference between learning a policy and executing a policy, right? So you can be executing a policy that's telling you what to think about, where that policy is something that you've learned over your lifetime, or you've come up with while you've been sort of solving problems that are similar to this in the last couple of years, or in the last month, or in the last week, or whatever it is. You have much more time and many more experiences to allow you to come up with something which is a pretty good policy for making decisions in general. And then you are just executing that policy at the point where you're making an individual decision. So while this problem is harder, it's also something you've got more time to solve. And it's something where the process of solving that could come from evolution, learning, or you just thinking about what's a good way to solve problems like this, right? In a sort of offline way. And so for that reason, even though it's more complicated, I kind of think we have sort of a variety of tools for solving it. Now, I also showed you when we went to the results from the heuristics, right? I also showed you that people are not necessarily doing a great job of deciding what strategy to use in what situation. And that's consistent with them having difficulty solving that particular problem. I think that's very plausible. That's a hard problem to solve, right? So the meta level problem is difficult, but nonetheless, people are doing a reasonable job. You don't have to solve it perfectly in order to do a reasonable job of making good decisions. All right, I think that is it for questions.
Yeah, probably I have a general question. So as resource rationale is very good theory for describing human cognition at computational level. But do you think for today's large language models, we can still use cognitive, the resource rationale to explain such phenomena or any cognitive phenomena we have observed in the large language model systems?
Yeah, so we have a paper where we use the same framework looking at large language models. So I just put it in the chat here. Basically, you can think about what large language models are doing, right, in the same way where, in particular, the inference time compute that's executed by large language models involves this kind of trade-off, right, where you're generating additional tokens because you think that they're going to help you solve the problem better. And so we have results that show that generating additional tokens when you're doing sort of chain of thought doesn't always result in better performance. And then the paper that I just linked to looks at, can you use something like this kind of objective to actually make large language models do a better job of generating their tokens that result in improvements in performance while minimizing the number of tokens that are generated, right? So that you're not creating additional energy costs or additional monetary costs for using that system for solving a problem when it could in fact solve that problem without engaging in a lot of like chain of thought prompting. So this is really relevant if you're using any of these like reasoning models, right? Where you like put in your thing and you come back 5 minutes later and it has an answer for you. It's probably not the case that you need to use that model to answer every question that you ask the AI system. At the moment, that decision is being made by you as the user. What kind of AI system should I use? But it's also something that we can automate by using this kind of approach.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Hi, Tom. Sorry, I have one question.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the really great talk. And actually, I really like the research rationality model, and I have already used the MATLAB MDP framework in my own research. And when I use this model, actually, I have one question. So the model assumes that people just weight the utility based on their subject beliefs and their computational costs to get optimal or resource rational strategy. But actually, I think people's subjective beliefs about the world, sometimes it may be inaccurate or it may be distorted. So for example, when we drive or solve a method of MDP, we got an optimal strategy, and we compare this strategy to humans' actual strategy, we found they are sometimes different. I think one possibility is that, so maybe people, they just inaccurately estimated the external world, and they think they have got a good strategy or research rational strategy, but actually they don't, just because they are distorted in evaluate the external world. Do you think it's possible to test this kind of hypothesis, so we introduce people's distortion of the subjective value, subjective uncertainty, so into this this framework?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So one funny thing about this, right, is that at the point where you're making this final decision, you're making a decision to maximize expected utility based on the beliefs that you have. And so that's dependent on, in order for this to end up being a good decision, the beliefs that you have need to end up being things that are sort of getting closer to the world, that are sort of and calibrated to that world ultimately, right? But there's nothing that guarantees that in this framework. And so people can make decisions that are internally resource rational, but don't align with what's going on in the world. So I think it's worth distinguishing those two things, right? There's sort of like this internal standard of rationality versus this problem of calibration. And that's something that we also see just in sort of classic rational models, where we can explain some of the weird things that people do in terms of them having particular prior distributions or other assumptions that are not consistent with the actual distribution of things in the world. So I think about this as a tool that you can use for actually probing what those beliefs are, right? You can make different models that make different assumptions, and then by comparing them against human behavior, you can make some inferences about the way that people might be implicitly representing that problem.
Okay, great, thanks.
Cool. Any other questions for Tom? Okay. So thank you, Tom, for coming to our community to give such an excellent talk. I believe many of our AI audience have benefited so much from learning from the talk and chatting to you. So yeah, thank you, Tom, again.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.